Chapter 2251. Freya took Didi's hand. Come on. Let's go into the house for dinner. At 9 p.m., Colton came back home. As he walked into the living room, he saw the servant cleaning the dining table. Mr. Goldman, you've come back. He responded with a faint hum and removed his tie. Has Didi come home? Miss Southern sent Miss Didi back a long time ago. Miss Pruitt claimed that Miss Didi's appetite improved after going out to play with Miss Southern. She ate 2 bowls of rice tonight, which means that Miss Didi had a good time. He paused for a while. From what I know, Didi's appetite has never been very good. Not only has she been losing weight, but she's also a little malnourished. And Freya has been extremely worried about her condition. He had tried his best to find someone to cure Didi. All he wanted to see was Freya not having to worry too much about her. He went upstairs, walked past Didi's room, and heard laughter coming from inside. It was Freya and her. The boy who played with you, did you ask him for his name? Didi was lying on the bed, holding the teddy bear, and thought for a short while. Those boys call him Connor, but I didn't ask his name. It doesn't matter, you'll get to make even more new friends in the future. Didi looked at her. Auntie Freya, then, can I not take medicine already? Freya was stunned for a split second. She then looked at Didi, raised her hand, and caressed her cheek. I told you, didn't I? You don't have to take any pills if you don't want to. Didi hugged the teddy bear in her arms tightly. Then can I not see Dr. Blueman again? She's scary. Freya suddenly felt distressed and asked, upon recalling Cameron's reminder, did Dr. Blueman come to visit you today? When Cameron came to pick Didi up and took her out, I was still sleeping. The maid told me that Didi was waiting for Cameron in the yard, and she also witnessed Jessie and Cameron's encounter. When Cameron told me to be careful of Jessie, it was obvious that Jessie had somehow given herself away in front of her. Didi nodded. Freya asked, did she say anything to you? Didi rubbed the fluffy teddy bear and answered truthfully. She said I'm just a foster child here. And you'll dump me as soon as you give birth to the baby. Freya's gaze turned stem instantly. Didi continued to ask cautiously, Auntie Freya, will you dump me? Nonsense. Freya held her hand. I will never dump you. Even if I have a baby in the future, you'll still be my Didi. So, promise me, don't listen to this nonsense anymore. If anyone else tells you the same thing, you can always let me know, okay? Didi nodded ignorantly. Now go to sleep. Freya coaxed her. Didi closed her eyes. After a short while of waiting for her to fall asleep, Freya turned off the light on the bedside table, got up, and left the room. She came to the master bedroom, and as soon as she opened the door, she saw Colton sitting on the bed. Freya was startled. You've come home? He responded with a hum, unbuttoned his cuffs, and asked in a hoarse voice, did Didi have a good time today? Freya closed the door. Yes, Cameron took her to the zoo, and she got to meet other children and made some new friends too. She turned her head, stared at Colton, and said calmly, ever since Cameron came here, Didi has been smiling a lot more than before, so I don't think she'll ever need Dr. Blueman's treatment again. I'll give it to you straight then. I don't trust her. Even if Colton thinks that I'm being unreasonable or misunderstands me, I will never lead Didi to that kind of person again. After a long silence, Colton replied, okay. Freya was astounded and slightly surprised. Are you agreeing to that? Chapter 2252. Colton got up and stopped in front of her. As long as you're happy with the decision. Freya's eyelashes trembled. Colton, are you doing so just to make me happy? Did he only agree to my request because it'll make me happy? Colton hugged her, rested his chin on her shoulder, and his tightly pursed lips moved slightly. I'm sorry. In fact, he had heard everything when he was at the door. Freya has always been doubting Jessie, but I, on the other hand, have always thought that it's Didi's problem. It's not so much that I trust Jessie, it's just that I don't trust Didi. Didi has acted very extremely before, so I've been extremely vigilant of her, especially now that Freya is pregnant. So, all I've ever thought about is Freya and the baby in her womb. I've never once suspected that it could be Jesse's problem. And to guard against a child, I actually questioned the child's intention only because of what she's done before this, building a layer of stubbornness, prejudice, and discrimination. He scoffed at himself inwardly. After what I've done, I have no right to complain about Freya when she only thinks about Dee Dee. And how will I be able to distinguish myself from those who hurt Dee Dee? Seeing that he had leaned his head against the side of her head and remained unusually silent, Freya turned to look at him. "Colton, are you all right?" He turned his head away to avoid her, and his voice sounded hoarse. "I'm fine. I'll go and take a shower first. You should rest early." He then walked toward the bathroom. Freya was a little confused. What happened to him? Freya was pregnant and had always been very sleepy, so she would fall asleep very quickly. She fell asleep almost instantly after lying down. Colton walked to the edge of the bed in his nightgown, stood beside the bed for a long time, picked up his cell phone, and left the room. Everything he did was done very lightly, for fear of waking her up. He came to the balcony, and the cold late autumn breeze brushed through his short hair. The expression that was partially covered by shadow looked gloomy and stern as he picked up his cell phone and dialed Leonardo's number. Leonardo, who was woken up in the middle of the night, answered the call with confusion. "Who is this?" "It's me." Hearing the familiar voice, Leonardo glanced at the caller ID and got up from bed abruptly. "Mr. Goldman, you. Is everything okay? You're to look into all of Jessie Bluman's previous medical visit records tomorrow, including all the hospitals where she worked before this, and find out why she left." Leonardo was stunned for a bit and wanted to say something, but the other party had already hung up. He scratched his hair. Did he just call me in the middle of the night just for this? Being an assistant is really a hellish experience. I even have to answer phone calls from my boss in the middle of the night. He then lay down and immediately fell asleep again. The next day, early in the morning, Cameron turned over and felt a little warm. She wanted to push her blanket away in order to get away from the heat source, but realized that she could not do so. She opened her eyes instantly, saw a big man lying beside her, was astonished for half a second, and then sat up immediately. Wayne Goldman. Waylon was lying on his side with one hand propped against his temple. The dark velvet nightgown was slightly loosened around his neckline, and he looked extremely languid. "I came to call you for breakfast, but saw you sleep soundly like a pig, so I could not bear to disturb you. You summoning me for breakfast is fine by me, but you actually climbed onto my bed. Are you shameless?" She pulled the blanket and wrapped herself in it. Although they had shared a bed in the small fishing village on the East Islands, the situation was different back then. What was more, the man was staring at her like a beast staring at a piece of flesh. He squinted. "I only got into your bed. I haven't gotten into you, so relax." Cameron choked on her own words, and her cheeks flushed as if they were about to explode. She instantly picked up her pillow and started hitting him. Wayne Goldman, I'm going to kill you. Chapter 2253. The pillow that slammed onto Waylon's body felt like a rectangular tofu. Neither did it hurt, nor did it itch. He grabbed Cameron with his huge hand, yanked her, rolled over, and sat on her body. Cameron froze, and the arrogance that she was exuding just now disappeared almost instantly. She warned him in a cowardly manner, "Don't you dare touch me." He raised his eyebrows slightly, and got half an inch closer to her face. He was so close to her that his breath was brushing against her cheek. "But aren't you the legendary Mr. Southern, who's known for his courage?" She forced a smile. No, I'm a very timid lady." His lips seemed about to stick to her ear. "What are you afraid of? Didn't you tell Dee Dee that I wouldn't eat others when we were in the car the other day?" Cameron pursed her lips, and her eyelashes twitched. Her heart was knocking against her chest frantically, thumping extremely loudly. Waylon stared at her face and rubbed the corners of her lips with his fingertips, and she could feel the surrounding temperature in the narrow space rise. Seeing that he was approaching, Cameron closed her eyes tightly. After a long time, he gave off a hoarse chuckle, and his lips landed on her forehead. It's time to get up. Immediately after that, he sat up, adjusted his nightgown, got off the bed, and left the bedroom. Cameron opened her eyes and was dumbfounded. Did he just leave? Cameron rubbed her forehead, and there was still a hint of residual warmth. She immediately buried her face into the pillow in shame. Cameron Southern, wake up, don't be captivated by his looks. Cameron freshened herself and went downstairs. Waylon had already changed into his clothes. He was wearing a suit and leather shoes, looking exceptionally solemn. It was her first time seeing his formally styled hair. He looked mature, stern, sharp, and breathtakingly handsome. Cameron also realized that the shirt he was wearing was the one that she had bought him. Waylon fetched her a bowl of berry oatmeal. Don't you plan to accompany Dee Dee today? Come and eat something first. She pulled out the chair, sat down, picked up the spoon, and stirred the oatmeal. What important occasion are you attending today? He lifted his gaze. It's just a board meeting. Oh. Why ask? Are you afraid that I'll go out and fool around with other women? Cameron choked on her own words and oatmeal. Who would be worried that you'll fool around with other women? You can do whatever you like. Waylon laughed. If I were to do whatever I like, would you still let me into the house? She replied with a chuckle, can I even exert any control over you? He interlocked his fingers and placed them under his chin. Then do you want to be in control? There was an implicit meaning lying underneath the question. Cameron lowered her head to eat her oatmeal. Who would want to control? You? He smiled and did not say anything. After breakfast, he picked up his windbreaker, walked to the entryway, stopped by the shoe cabinet, turned around, and stared at her. Cameron. Cameron looked at him. What do you want? He waved at her, motioning her to go to him. Cameron walked up to him, got jerked into his arms unexpectedly, and was startled. Seeing that Waylon was pointing at the tie around his neck, his intention was as clear as day. The corners of her lips twitched. Are your hands broken? Waylon caressed her lips and brushed across them gently. Don't forget that I'm the one who's paying you your salary. Cameron was at a loss for words. As soon as I pay off my debt, I'll definitely get back at him. She helped him with his tie. Waylon pinched her chin abruptly, lifted her face, and sealed her warm lips. Cameron wanted to push him away, but was restrained by him. In the next second, he sucked on her neck all of a sudden, and an electrical jolt shot up Cameron's spine as she pushed him away. Wayne Goldman, you. Upon catching a glimpse of the hickey that he left on her neck, the corners of his lips twitched. Very nice, it looks perfect. He then pulled open the door and left in a good mood. At Black Gold. Waylon walked out of the elevator and ran into Leonardo in the corridor. Leonardo was holding a stack of documents in his hand and nodded. Mr. Goldman. He took a glance at the documents in his arms. Does the company have so many agendas to deal with? Leonardo was stunned for half a second and replied instantly, these aren't the company's affairs. These are information about Miss Blueman, chapter 2254. Waylon stroked the dial of his watch with his fingertips and lifted his gaze. Isn't she the psychologist? It seems that he's discovered that something's wrong. Leonardo whispered, I don't know what's gone wrong with Mr. Goldman. He's the one who asked me to look into her background. Waylon smiled. Then, did you find anything? Not yet. After replying to the question, Leonardo thought of something and stopped for a split second. But Miss Blueman has been coming to the company very often recently, like once every 2 to 3 days, and that's rather strange to me. Waylon squinted. Since when have the rumors about Freya started spreading in the company? Leonardo was caught off guard and gave it a good thought for a moment. About this. Mr. Goldman has questioned the people in all the departments, and they claim that the rumors have been spreading around since half a year ago. It's just they didn't dare to talk about them when Mr. Goldman and I were around. He then asked, curiously, "Mr. Goldman, why are you asking me this?" Wayland patted him on the shoulder and gave off a pregnant smirk. "It's about time to dig deeper into Dr. Blueman's life. Remember not to startle your target during your investigation." Leonardo realized something and nodded. "Understood." Wayland pushed open the door of the administrative office. Colton was leaning forward slightly on the couch with his legs apart, his elbows propped against his knees, and his fingers interlocked as he looked deep in thought. It was not until Wayland approached that he raised his head. "Wayland." Wayland sat across from him. "Are you starting to doubt that woman now?" He replied with a faint hum, lowered his gaze, and hesitated. Wayland's gaze landed on the teacup on the table. "I don't blame you. After all you want is to heal Dee. As long as the doctor is experienced enough and has a great resume to prove it, no one will think to look into what kind of person they are." "Wayland," Colton's eyes moved. "I seem to have done something wrong. It seems that I'm the one who caused all this." Wayland reached out and placed his hand on his shoulder. "Everyone makes mistakes. At least you can make up for it now." He looked away awkwardly. "Dee is terrified of me." Wayland chuckled. "What in the world? Is it so difficult for you to discard your self-esteem and apologize to a child? You're someone who's about to become a father. If you still don't know how to coax a child, that will be bad." Colton covered his forehead. "You've come here only to mock me, haven't you?" Colton covered his forehead. "You've come here only to mock me, haven't you?" Wayland laughed again. "Just coax her like how you did when you wronged Daisy back then. Dee is also a girl. As long as you put some effort and thoughts into it, there's no girl in this world who can't be coaxed." He turned his face away. "Freya is definitely one of them. Let's put coaxing her when she's feeling down or upset aside. She will straight up give me her signature mean look when that happens." Wayland fiddled with the teacup on the table and sneered. "It has to be Freya, she's definitely the one. If the woman standing in her position today was another woman, would you ever know what it's like to read the room and learn how to coax a lady? When you can put on a shitty face, you'll have to allow her to do so too, and she's certainly someone that will do so. I seriously think a woman who'll never give you any face and torture you mentally is exactly the woman that you need in your life." Colton was rendered speechless. Is he here to comfort me, or to make me feel even shittier? At the same time, in the Seaview Villa, Cameron had tied a silk scarf around her neck. She was sitting in the living room holding a teacup and waiting until Dee sprinted downstairs. "Aunt Cameron." Cameron smiled and stretched her arms outward. Dee threw herself into her arms. Cameron hugged her tiny and soft body, and her heart was on the brink of melting away. "Do you still want to go to the same place to play soccer today?" She nodded happily. "Yes." Cameron smiled and said, "Okay, then we'll depart after you tell your Auntie Freya that you're going out with me." Freya walked downstairs, and Dee ran up to her. "Auntie Freya, can I go out and play with Aunt Cameron today?" Freya took a glance at Cameron and chuckled. "Of course, go and have fun, but be careful." Cameron got up and held Dee's hand. "Then let's go." Chapter 2255. Freya watched them go out, and the maid beside her said with a smile, "Miss Dee seems to really like playing with Miss Southern." She added, "I believe that Miss Southern will open up Miss Dee's heart." Cameron and Dee walked out of the courtyard, and the two got into her car. At this time, the people sitting in a car parked not far away quietly followed after seeing their car leave. Cameron played a nursery rhyme to Dee in the car and gave her a Barbie doll that she had prepared for her in the car. Dee sat in the back seat, and the beautiful Barbie doll in her hand had obviously captured her attention. Cameron looked in the rearview mirror and smiled. "Dee, do you like Barbie dolls?" She lifted her head. "Yes." "Glad to hear that." All of a sudden, something clicked in her mind, and she suggested with a smile, "Dee, how about you come over and stay with me tonight? I bought a lot of toys for you." With Dee around the villa, Wayne would not dare to make any move on me already, would he? Dee thought about it for a few seconds. I need to ask Auntie Freya's permission for that. She smiled. Okay, you can ask her when we get back. When she turned to the right, she saw a car following them in the rearview mirror. Cameron narrowed her eyes and stepped on the accelerator immediately. I'm driving Wayne's car, and I've been very careful on the road. But it'll be fine if it gets damaged or even broken. He has money. But scaring Dee Dee is not an option. After taking another look at the car following them, they had indeed been following them. Cameron turned around and drove the car into the tunnel. The car slowed down instantly and followed them into the tunnel too. The corners of her lips twitched slightly. That's interesting. Dee Dee, you can continue to play with the Barbie doll in the car later. You mustn't leave the car before I get back here. I have a problem to solve. Dee Dee tilted her head and nodded obediently. Okay. Cameron pulled the car over inside the tunnel, increased the volume of the music by a little, turned on the double signal, opened the door, and got out of the car. The car behind them stopped too, and a few young thugs got out of the car. They thought her car had broken down and wanted to stop them and ask for help. Yo, young lady, has your car broken down? Let us help you fix it. Before he could even finish the sentence, Cameron had already grabbed him by the collar, bent his knees, and kicked him in the crotch. The man trembled from head to toe, and his expression was terribly distorted. When the other men saw this, they rushed up immediately, but Cameron dealt with all of them without much effort and knocked them all down in 2 or 3 strokes. She grabbed one of the men who had dyed his hair blonde, pressed him against the hood, took out a butterfly knife, fidgeted with it, and stabbed the tip of the blade in the gap between the man's fingers. The blonde man trembled with fright. Don't. Please don't kill me. Mercy, please. Cameron approached him. Tell me, why are you following us? The blonde man gulped his saliva and answered hurriedly, someone asked us to do so. All we need to do is get rid of you and that little girl. We're doing this only for the money. They originally thought the job was kidnapping a woman and a child. They did not even bring a man along when they came out, so it would only be a walk in the park. But who would have known that this woman was so powerful? Cameron grabbed his hair and lifted his face. Is your employer a woman? The blonde man's scalp hurt so much that he was on the verge of shedding tears. I only know that the man who hired us is a man. We don't really know him either. Is it so? Then give me the man's contact information. Ah? The blonde man was stunned. Cameron fiddled with the knife in her hand and gave off a sullen smirk. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll just chop off your fingers one by one. Okay. I'll give it to you. Chapter 2256. The blonde man immediately took out his phone and found the mobile number. Cameron took the phone and looked at it. A man suddenly attacked her from behind, but she kicked at the side of his head like a gust of wind. The man flew several feet back and was so afraid he stayed on the ground and didn't dare get up. The blonde man was sweating bullets. This woman is vicious. Cameron memorized the number and then looked at the man. When I started out, you were still playing with dirt. You're not going to attack me with such terrible skills. The blonde man trembled and got on his knees. I'm sorry, it was a mistake. We won't do it again. Cameron handed his phone back to him. He tried to get it, but Cameron took it back. Do you have time? The blonde man was confused. What do you want? If you do, stay and work for me. If you decline, Cameron balled up her fist, and her knuckles cracked. The man immediately stood up. Yes, I have time, sir. At your service. Let's go. Cameron turned to leave. The blonde man looked at his friends, who were all over the ground. They were pretending to be dead and wished him good luck with their eyes. Dee Dee had been waiting for a long time in the car until Cameron sat in the back seat with her. The blonde man suddenly got into the driver's seat. When he saw the logo of the car, his hands started sweating because that was the first time he had ever gotten to drive a luxury car. Cameron glared at him. Drive safely. Your life is in my hands. The man smiled. Sure, sir, will do. After that, he awkwardly asked, where are we headed, sir? Citizen Park. Alright, Dee curiously looked at Cameron. Who is he? Cameron touched her hair. He's our driver today, West. The man pressed his lips together. My name isn't West, sir. Cameron glared at him. Your name is West if I say it's West. The man cowardly said, alright, my name is West then. When they got to Citizen Park, Dee bumped into a group of boys who were playing soccer. Connor Heigl turned and saw Dee, then waved at her. Hey, Dee. Dee turned to look at Cameron as if she was asking for her permission. Cameron smiled and gently pushed her forward. Go ahead if you want to. She smiled and ran over to them. The blonde man tried to escape while she was distracted, but a pebble came out of nowhere after he took a few steps, hit his legs, and he fell. Cameron crossed her arms and stood behind him. Trying to run away, the blonde man slowly turned around and was terrified. Sir, I just need to go to the loo. Cameron smirked. Hold it in. I have questions for you. A chill ran down the back of the man's spine. Meanwhile, Leonardo rushed to Asperia, where Jesse had been working, to find out more about her. A few nurses saw how handsome he looked, so they were interested. Are you Jesse's friend? He looked uneasy. No, we don't know each other that way. She's just the psychologist of my cousin's child. It's been a long time, yet the child is still disturbed, so, he didn't continue, but observed their expressions. A nurse who was drinking water turned to look at him. We don't know her very well. Why don't you ask Dr. Jefferson? Chapter 2257. Yes. Jessie Blueman always acted as if she was above us, nurses. She didn't want to spend time with us, but was pretty close with the doctors from the surgery department. Leonardo squinted and thought. The nurse didn't seem to think highly of Jessie. Do you know why she resigned? The nurse laughed. Because of Dr. Jefferson. She's his ex, and they were together for half a year. I heard him say that he bought a house in the center of Asperia so that they could get married, but Jessie was pregnant. She said that the child was his, but we all knew that he had been on the night shift for the entire month and didn't have time to see her. It was impossible that the child was his. After Dr. Jefferson found out about that, they had a huge fight, and then she quit. I guess she was feeling guilty. Leonardo frowned. Were there any problems with her other patients? The nurse replied, there weren't any issues with her sessions. Lots of people sought therapy from her. By the way, most of her clients are ladies, mostly housewives with depression. Another nurse remembered something and said, I heard that one of them is from Basberg, in her 40s. Her husband is in the F&B industry, and is quite well off. She suspected that her husband was having an affair, so her mental state wasn't the best. She visited Jessie a lot of times, and was pretty close to her. She would tip her a few $100s every time. Leonardo asked, do you know her name? I don't remember her name, but I've heard Jessie call her Mrs. George. Leonardo stopped asking questions, and left the hospital. After he got in the car, he thought about what the nurses had said. Jessie had left the hospital half a year ago, which meant she went straight to Basberg after that. She had even found out that Colton was looking for a psychologist. The nurse had said that Jessie was pregnant, but it didn't look that way for the past half a year. That seemed to indicate that she had an abortion. And Mrs. George. Why did that sound familiar? He had heard of that name before. Something flashed across his mind, and he was shocked. Could it be such a huge coincidence? That afternoon, in the Citizen Park, Dee got tired after running around with her friends, and was resting on a bench while waiting for Cameron to return. Connor walked over and handed her a cone. She took it. Thanks, Con. He took a seat next to her and asked, is your mom not back yet? Dee paused, then replied, she's not my mom. She's my friend. Connor scratched his head in embarrassment. Oh, she's your friend? I thought she was your mom. Dee Dee looked down and didn't speak. All these other children had parents who would pick them up, but she had never even met her own parents. At that moment, an older man stood nearby and called out, "Young master." Connor nodded, got up, and said to Dee Dee, "My butler is here, so I have to go. Let's play again next time." Dee Dee nodded. Connor walked to the older man, held his hand, and walked away. The evening sun shone on the grass, while the park, which was filled with laughter, slowly grew quiet. Chapter 2258. Dee Dee watched while her peers left with their parents. She held on to her cone and looked dismayed. She heard footsteps approaching and turned around to see a woman she didn't know standing next to her, looking dark. She stood up in fear. She fell to the ground because the woman suddenly slapped her. Her ice cream fell to the ground and blended in with the mud. That woman wouldn't let her go and grabbed onto her hair like a mad woman. "You little bitch, I finally caught you. How could you be seducing men at this age? You're just as shameless as your mother. I'm going to teach you a lesson today." The woman kicked Dee Dee, which made her cry out in pain, as though her grandmother was hitting her. Her eyes slowly lost hope and started dimming. After a few kicks, she wasn't done yet and ended up sitting on her and choking her neck. Dee Dee was almost out of breath. When Cameron came back, she saw that and rushed forward to kick the woman to the ground. Dee Dee's voice was hoarse from crying, and her body was shaking. Cameron helped her up. "Dee Dee." That woman got up and pointed at Cameron. "You're the bitch who seduced my husband. You gave birth to this bastard and told my husband to get a divorce from me, right? I'm going to teach you a lesson and kill the women who destroy families." The woman lunged at Cameron, but the latter grabbed her by her shoulder and threw her to the ground. The woman held in pain while Cameron kicked at her. Cameron walked closer, grabbed her by her collar, and started slapping her. "You belong in an asylum. Your husband cheating on you is none of our business." The woman's mouth started bleeding while she shuddered. You hit me." Cameron slapped her again. "Are you thinking clearly now?" The woman was shocked by her ferocity. Her face was obviously swollen. Cameron showed her a mobile number saved in her phone. "Do you know who this number belongs to?" The woman looked at it and yelled, "And you pretend not to know my husband? You bitch." Before she could finish, Cameron slapped her again. This slap was enough to daze her, and she fell sideways to the ground. Cameron grabbed her by her hair and raised her head. "Ronald George is your husband. Great. I'll remember that. Neither of you is getting away. What are you going to do?" Gina looked terrified. Cameron smiled coldly. "You don't need to know, Mrs. George. If you knew the truth, you would cry. If anything happened to this child, it would be the end of you too." She pushed Gina away, walked to Dee Dee, picked her up, and left. Meanwhile, Jessie quietly recorded everything that happened. She happily watched the video on her phone, posted it on Twitter after editing it, and made a call. "Help me get a tweet to trending. Best if you could destroy that person." Cameron drove Dee Dee to a hospital. When Dee Dee was getting treatment, Cameron leaned against the wall. She had never been that angry at anyone. She had almost killed that woman. Chapter 2259. Cameron had forced West to contact that man, and the latter confirmed where they would meet the next day. He had also found out the owner of the phone from the mobile service provider. She had assumed that leaving Dee Dee at the park with the children would be fine, but she didn't expect that someone would attack her. When she saw the bruises Dee Dee had, including the choking marks on her neck, she felt extremely guilty. A group of people walked out of the elevator. She looked up and saw that Waylon was walking ahead of the bodyguards. Waylon frowned and stopped in front of her. "How's Dee Dee?" "I don't know yet." Cameron stood up and looked down. "I'm sorry. It was my fault." Waylon placed a hand on her shoulder. "You can't change anything now. Let's see what the doctor has to say." Soon after that, the doctor walked out of the room. Cameron immediately walked forward and asked, "How is she?" Her injuries aren't severe, so she's mostly fine. You parents need to take better care of your child. It'll be too late when something bad happens. After the doctor gave his diagnosis, he added that piece of advice. Cameron's head hung low as she stood in silence. She nodded, then went into the room. Dee Dee lay in bed with a dark bruise on her forehead. Cameron sat next to the bed and held Dee Dee's hand. I'm sorry, it's all my fault. I should have come back earlier. I'm so sorry. Cameron looked down as she felt extreme guilt. Dee Dee looked at her. I'm fine, Cam. It just hurts a little. Grandma would hurt me even more. Cameron couldn't hold it on when she heard it. She looked up, and her eyes were wet. Dee Dee, no one will ever dare touch you again. She took a deep breath, looked at Dee Dee, and touched the bruise on her forehead. If anyone hits you, hit them back. We don't bully, but we won't tolerate bullying either. Dee Dee blinked in surprise. But people who hit others are bad children. Cameron smiled and taped her nose. Only those that bully are bad children. You were bullied. When you hit them while being bullied, it's self-defense. Self-defense is a way to protect yourself. If you can protect yourself, you'll be able to protect the people that you want to protect the most. Dee Dee was surprised. After a child's innocence was broken, all their dreams would have been crushed, and they would no longer look forward to anything in the world. They would also be cynical toward everything and everyone around them, but what Cameron told her was like a pebble tossed into the water. The splash wasn't big, but it started a ripple. Waylon watched what happened and smiled, then turned to leave the room with a cold expression. Cameron stayed with Dee Dee in the room for a long time before leaving. When she walked out, she saw Waylon making calls in the corridor and headed toward him. Waylon ended the call and turned to face her while putting his phone away. Why are you out? Cameron looked down. What happened was my fault. I'll take the blame if Freya and your brother need an explanation. She was responsible for Dee Dee's injuries. Even if they blamed her, she wouldn't say anything and would just accept what happened. Waylon smiled and approached her. You want to take responsibility? Chapter 2260. Of course, Cameron said in a serious tone. Dee Dee was admitted because of my negligence. I have the biggest responsibility. Waylon pulled her into his arms, which surprised her. He leaned in and planted his lips on her forehead. Don't worry. I'm here. She looked away. I don't need you to help me. Waylon pinched her chin. You better think about it. Freya is pregnant. If she finds out that Dee Dee is hurt, can you really bear the consequences if anything happens to her? Cameron froze. She never thought about that. Pregnant women shouldn't be under stress. If anything happened to Freya, the Goldmans would cut her into pieces. She pressed her lips together. How would you help me? He smiled. It'd be easier if you were part of the family. Cameron stared at him and moved her hand away after a long pause. You're trying to fool me again? Waylon adjusted his coat and raised his brows. Do you really think that way? She turned around. Even if Freya is pregnant, she will soon find out about what happened to Dee Dee. Can we hide it from her? It doesn't matter if we can. Most importantly, you can help Dee Dee open up her heart. Waylon looked at her. Win them over with good results. Cameron crossed her arms and suddenly chuckled. Alright, I'll bring Dee Dee over to Emperon and give her a new Dee Dee back. Waylon smiled. Sure. Cameron was going back to the room, but she suddenly remembered something, so she turned to look at him. By the way, can you get someone to look into Ronald George? It's best to find out who's behind him. He raised his brows. Do I get a reward? You get a pig's foot. She wrinkled her nose, then turned and went into the room. Waylon chuckled, because this woman was getting more and more adorable. That night at 9:30 p.m., at the Seaview Villa, Colton parked in the driveway. The house was brightly lit. He stood outside for a while before going in. The maid told him that Freya was already asleep. He walked upstairs and pushed the door of the master bedroom open gently. Freya had left a light on for him. Colton walked to the bed and sat down. Freya opened his eyes, but was still dazed. "You're back." Colton nodded, and his hand that was reaching out to touch her face hung in midair. He took it back. "Didi will be staying at Emperon for a while." She was half away, and her voice was drowsy. "I know." He gently said, "Go back to sleep." Freya didn't reply, as though she really was back in a deep sleep. He took a shower in the next room's bathroom, then lit a cigarette on the balcony. He never smoked, but had recently started picking up the habit. The night was dark, as was he. The smoke blew around his face as he squinted and remembered what Leonardo had discovered. Gina George was the woman who had started rumors in the casino. Her husband was Ronald George. Ronald cheated multiple times when his wife was pregnant. That was how she developed depression, which lasted for 4 years. Her psychologist was Jesse Blueman. Half a year ago, he had sent Didi to Jesse for treatment. If Jesse had been coercing Didi from the start, that would prove that all that Didi did in the past half a year was related to her. However, he only listened to Jesse and thought Didi was refusing treatment. He never thought why she would reject it. He closed his eyes, thinking he had pushed a child into the deep end. He couldn't face Freya and Didi.